We're up to the Mishnah in Mirza Hashem on Daf Yud Dalit, and a lot of what we're going to do in tonight's shir comes from the parsha of Parah Aduma, which is a very unique parsha. In any event, the Mishnah that we're learning, which starts with the word Kol Shivas Yomim, is a continuation of the Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta with regard to the 7 days in which the Kohen Gadol is secluded in the Lishkas HaSanhedrin, and for 7 days he is preparing himself for the avoda of Yom Kippurim. And you may recall that the Gemara back at the beginning of the Perek derived this halacha of Prisha of 7 days from various sources in the Torah. According to Reish Lakish and according to Rabbi Yochanan, each one has a different source. Now, what was the Kohen Gadol occupied with in order to prepare himself during this week before Yom Kippur? Kol Shivas Yomim hu zorek es hadam. Now, as you know, on a daily basis, there were 2 Tmidim, one in the morning, Tamid Shel Shachar, one in the evening, Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. And this was done every single day of the year. During these 7 days, the Kohen Gadol was the one who would be in charge of the Shnei Tmidim as a preparation for the Avod of Yom Kippur. Now, the Mishnah only mentions Zrikas Adam, and then later on, we'll see other aspects of the Avoda, the Ketores, the Neros, and so forth and so on. But as far as the Talmud is concerned, we're not talking about just Zrikas Adam. Any korban, the Talmud included, begins with Shechita, and then after Shechita is Kabbalah Sadam. Why then does the Mishnah say nothing about Shechita or Kabbalah? It goes straight to Zrikas Adam. Very difficult question. What we have is in the Torah says, Zayisha shatakriv l'Hashem, kvasim b'nei shanot mimim, shnayim layom Allah samid, es hakeves echad taseh b'boker, es hakeves hashini taseh ben arbaim. Why not Shechita and Kabbalah? So here we have something very, very interesting in one of the Mefarshei Talmud, and that is that the preparation during these 7 days should be a mirror image of what the Kohen Gadol is going to do on Yom Kippur. And that means the following, that if the Avodah during these 7 days exactly mirrors the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, then that's exactly what the Kohen Gadol is going to do. He's going to get involved in that avoda. But in event that there's a discrepancy between the avoda during the rest of the year and the avoda of Yom Kippurim, and now the 7 days are the days before Yom Kippurim, then it makes no sense to have the Kohen Gadol during those 7 days do the avoda that's different than the avoda that he's going to be implementing on Yom Kippur. And that's exactly what happens with regard to the Tmidim, both in Shechita and in Kabbalah. There's going to be a discrepancy between the avoda of the Tmimim during the rest of the year and that of Yom Kippur. How so and why? And the answer is the following. It is literally impossible for one person to do both Shechita and Kabbalah, because when you shech the animal, the blood comes out. You're busy with the knife, shechting the animal. How are you going to drop the knife and catch the blood as it comes flying out? It's just impossible. So during the year, we would separate between the Shochet and the Makabel. So we'll call him Ruvain did the Shechita, and Shimon was Makabel the Dam. But on Yom Kippurim, all the avodos have to be done by the Kohen Gadol himself. So you'll ask me, well, how's it possible for the Kohen Gadol to do Shechita and Kabbalah? It's just humanly impossible. What they did on Yom Kippurim is something very unique. The Kohen Gadol would begin the Shechita, and some other Kohen would complete the Shechita. What does that mean? The minimum Shechita is what's called Rov Shnayim. There are two Simonim. There's the cut in the Veshet, the windpipe in the esophagus. He has to cut, and this is true, by the way, for any Shochet in any Chulin, Rov, most of these two Simonim. What the Kohen Gadol would do on Yom Kippur, in order to allow him to be Makabel Adam, is that he would only start the Shechita. He would do the main part of the Shechita, which is enough to validate the Shechita because he shechted Rov Shnayim. Then another Kohen would take over and complete the Shechita. In the meantime, while the second Kohen was completing the Shechita, the Kohen Gadol would now pick up the Mizrach, the Kos, which is the Klishores, and be Makabel L'Dam. Now, this is not something that we can allow during the course of the year. So therefore, if we would, want to prepare the Kohen Gadol for the avoda that he does on Yom Kippurim with regard to Shechita and Kabbalah, we don't have that luxury. Hence, the only thing the Kohen Gadol would be involved in during this Shiva Yomim is Zrika, because Zrika is identical in the Shnei Atmidim the whole year round as it is on Yom Kippur. Now we go on to the next part of the Mishnah, Maktir es Haktoris. Now, as you know, on a daily basis, there was Haktores, not once, but twice a day. Half of the Ktores, which is called a shear of a moneh, so half of a moneh of Ktores, was burnt on the Mizbeach. We'll talk about which Mizbeach in just a second, for Shabbos. The other half of the moneh was put on the Mizbeach, Bein Harbayim, in the evening. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim would be in charge of both the Haktoras Boker and Bein HaTzoraim, Bein Harbayim. Hence, during the 7 days of preparation, the Kohen Gadol himself would get used to being maktir the Ketores twice a day. Now, where was the Ketores burnt? I'm sure you all know this, but it doesn't hurt to review even the basics. Am I right? And there are two mizbachos in the Beis Hamikdash. There's the Mizbeach HaChitzoni, which is otherwise known as the Mizbach HaNechoshes, and then there's the inner Mizbeach in the Heichal, which is called the Mizbeach HaPnimi, otherwise known as the Mizbach HaZav. The Ketores had to be brought inside the Kodesh, what we call the Heichal, on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the Mizbeach HaZav. This is all based on a pasuk at the end of Sefer Shmos. The Torah says, "V'ktir olav Aaron Torah samim ba'boker ba'boker." The double language of ba'boker is meant to teach us that this Torah of the Torah comes even before the Tamid Shel Shachar, because Tamid Shel Shachar only says boker, but in Torah it says boker ba'boker twice, and that's going to happen before, as we said before the Tamid Shel Shachar. And then the pasuk says, "By the heitivos haneros yaktirena, ubalos aronas haneros ben arbayim yaktirena." And it's interesting that the Torah, both in terms of the first Torah, which is the boker, and in terms of the second one, which is ben arbayim, in both cases the Torah connects it with the neros. And we'll soon see that the Neros were a mitzvah twice a day as well. Now the Kohen Gadol was maktir the Ketores on Yom Kippurim, both Boker and Erev, as we said before, Tosfos has another sheet over here. We didn't get up to this, but I'll just mention it when we start the Mishnah, and that is that the Kohen Gadol was only makdir the Torahs in the morning and not in the Bein Harbayim. Again, that's something futuristic for us later down the line. Now the Mishnah continues and says that the Kohen Gadol was Meitiv es Haneros. And here we have three different shitos as to what the Mishnah has in mind when it says Meitiv es Haneros. What is Meitiv? What is Hatova with regard to the Neros? Rashi shita is that Meitiv means to clean out the menorah. Right? Each part of the menorah had what's called a bazichin. Those were the receptacles where the oil and the wicks were put in. And twice a day, there was a necessity to clean out the wicks after they extinguished. That's Rashi Shita. The Ramban says that Atova doesn't mean cleaning out the bazichin, but on the contrary, it means pouring in the new oil and new wicks for the next hadlaka. The Rambam has a third shita. He thinks that Atova implies or encompasses both. It has, number one, nikui habazichin, like Rashi says, to clean out the bazichin. Number two, like the Ramban says, nesinas psilos v'shemen. So basically, you could have come to the conclusion that the Rambam is combining both Rashi and the Ramban. But in truth, he adds a third element into the equation, and that's hadlokas haneros. So when the Mishnah says meitiv es haneros, that the Kohen Gadol during the 7 days of preparation would be meitiv, what does hatova mean? According to the Rambam, it means A, B, and C. It means to be menaka, to clean out the bazichin. B, it means to put in the new oil and the wicks. And C, to be madlik the neros. Now the Mishnah speaks about another dimension of the karbonos hatamid, and that's not the hakrava per se, but what's called the haktaras ha'imurim. The tamid is a carbon ola, and a carbon ola is kulo kolil, is completely burnt on the mizbeach. And here the question is, we know that the Kohen Gadol did the Zrikas Hadam, which completes the Avodah and the Hakrava of the Talmud. This he did twice daily during the 7 days. What about the actual Haktaras HaImurim? Those parts, which in the case of an Ola means basically the entire lamb. What happens as far as the Kohen Gadol is concerned? So the Mishnah says, Umakriv es harosh ves haregel. So both in the morning and in the afternoon for the two karbanos tmidim, the Kohen Gadol would be makriv on the H, the rosh and the regel. And again, this trained him for the avodas Yom Kippur. So the Rishonim have a problem here. Why does the Mishnah single out the rosh and the regel? I mean, the entire carbon has to be brought on the maracha, the eish of the mizbeach. And the Meiri is so bothered by this that he says, Shar nischei atmidim, all the other segments of the karbonos tmidim, hukruvu al yidei bnei hamishmar. In other words, we know that there were 24 mishmaros, and they were divided into 7 batei av. Each base av got 1 day of the week. And we don't want to cut them out, says the Meiri. You want them to also get their share of the avodah. So therefore, the Kohen Gadol would do that part of the haktarah that's absolutely critical, the rosh and the raglayim, and now let the Kohen HaMishmar, who's on duty for that day, let him take over and burn the rest of the carbon. However, many, many hundreds of years after the Meiri, a commentary on the Mishnah, a super commentary on the Mishnah, was penned by the Tosfos Yontif. His last name was Heller. And the Tosfos Yontif says that the Mishnah only mentions Harosh Regel because these are the first parts of the animal that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach. And in truth, Hayam Makriv, Kohen Gadol, Eskol every atom. The Mishnah is using only a short form, an abbreviated language, mentioning just the Rosh and the Regel, because those are the first. But in truth, the Kohen Gadol had to be maktir all of the Nisachim, all of the Murim of the Talmud. And that's a very kind of strange machlokus between the Meiri that goes back, who knows, 9 centuries ago or more, and the Tosas Yontif who lived probably about 300 years ago. The Rambam writes that although the Mishnah should be taken literally, not the way, again, he didn't know about the Tosas Yontif, but not the way the Tosas Yontif understood it. And the Kohen Gadol was only involved in Haktaras HaRosh VaRegel of the Shnei Tamidim, Boker and Sora and Ein Arbaim. But the reason why he didn't complete the entire Haktarah is not the way the Meiri explained, because he wanted to give first dibs or an opportunity to the Anshe Mishmar to step up and participate in the Avodah, but for an entirely different reason. Says the Rambam, Lo rotzu latriach as HaKohen Gadol lahakriv eshar hevarim. In other words, the 7-day period of preparation serves 2 functions, and they seem to contradict one or the other. One function is to get him trained for the avodah of Yom Kippurim. The other function is to have him rest up and build up his powers, his physical stamina for a tremendously difficult day of avodah, which we'll only appreciate when we get to the end of this Masechta, of Yom Kippur. And therefore, says the Rambam, in order to juggle and find a compromise, they cut it down to the barest minimum. And that is the Aktar of the Rosh and the Raglayim. It would be too much of a physical exertion to demand of the Kohen Gadol twice daily for a full week before Yom Kippur that he do the Aktara of the entire Karban Olah. That would be physically exhausting, and we'd be defeating our purpose in strengthening the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. Ushar Kol Hayomim. Now the Mishnah moves over to a little bit of a tangent, and the Mishnah wants to know which avodos are incumbent upon the Kohen Gadol the rest of the year, the entire balance of the year. On Yom Kippurim, it's a one-man show. He does all the avodas. What avodah is specifically carved out and obligated and imposed as an obligation on the Kohen Gadol? Says the Mishnah, B'shar Kol Hayomim, Ratza lahakriv makriv, Kohen Gadol makriv chelek barash. It means he's first on line to decide which hakrava he wants to do. In effect, he can muscle his way in and neutralize any Kohen who is one of the Anshe Mishmar, or he won a pious, he won a hagrola. No. First, we ask the Kohen Gadol. And if he wants to be makriv, that's his right. Now, I'm not sure exactly why. I have 2 possible answers to this question. Maybe it's kvod Kohen Gadol. We have a halacha that the Kohen Gadol has to be Gadol be'echav, which means that all the regular Kohanim, the Frankenfall Kohanim, have to give special cover to the Kohen Gadol. Or maybe it's a different halacha. Maybe it's halacha in rights. The Torah invested zchuyot in the Kohen Gadol, and he has rights to choose whatever avodah he wants. No one could stop him. And then the Mishnah adds another point over here, Notel Chelik Barash. What does this mean? Many of the karbanos, with the exception of Ola, are eaten by the Kohen. So take, for example, a korban chatos, a korban osham, and even a korban shlamim, to a large extent, is eaten by the Kohen. They'll get the chaz v'shok. And then there was a whole system of chalukah, of how to divvy up the meat of the karbanos. Who would get on this day, who would get on that day, who would get which meat, which portion, and they decided through a lottery, etc., etc. The Kohen Gadol is notel chelek barash. He can decide which chelek of the korban he wants to eat. So not only does he have rights, first dibs, as you'd call it, to decide which hakrov and which avoda he wants to do personally, he also can decide which chelek in the basar he wants to take. And even if, and obviously he's not part of the Anshe Mishmar, so he doesn't participate in Agrola, nevertheless, he has the ability to trump any of the other Kohanim and take that chelek that he wants. And a lot of what I'm telling you, you'll find in the Rambam. Because when it comes to Kodshim, the Rambam is like the kingpin. And he has an entire section called Hilchos Masechet HaKarbanos. And there he goes into great detail about the Kohen Gadol's first rights in trumping the Anshe Mishmar. Now we begin the Gemara. Now, as I told you at the outset, tonight's limud is dedicated to the paraduma. And the mechatos, which was the concoction of special mayim that came from a natural spring, together with the ashes of the burnt paraduma. And after this was all mixed up, it had a special status and a special holiness called the mechatos. And twice during the week, in a case of a tummy mess, that's someone who obviously came in contact with the corpse, they did what's called hazah, and there was a special Kohen who sprinkled the water from this mixture called the mechatos twice a week on the third and seventh day, and that would prepare the person for tahara so that he can go now to the mikvah and purify himself from the most severe and intense of all tumas, namely tumas mes. So you can imagine that the mechatos of the paraduma was a very, very valuable entity. Man Tana, who is the Tana of our Mishnah? I would rewrite the text of the Gemara. Who is not the Tana of our Mishnah? Amar Rav Chizda de lo Rabbi Akiva. There's no way that you can justify this Mishnah according to Rabbi Akiva. There's no way that you can reconcile this Mishnah according to Rabbi Akiva. Because the whole purpose of the 7 days preparing the Kohen Gadol is so that he could be tahar for the avodas Yom Kippur. Now you may recall, back on Daf Ches, we had the statement of Rabbi Meir, one of the Tanoim, to the effect that in order to guarantee the purity of the Kohen Gadol, so that he's tahar and he could do the avodah during the 7 days, they did hazah. Now, you might say hazah for mechatos on the Kohen Gadol is not necessary, and that's really true, but just in case. And not only that, Rabbi Meir goes very far. He requires hazah on a daily basis. There's no tummy mess that requires hazah on a daily basis. So this was all a maila asu b'Kohen Gadol. They set up super high standards in the purification process of a Kohen Gadol. And that's what went on during these 7 days of preparation. That cannot be reconciled with Rabbi Akiva. Why not? Amar Rabbi Akiva states, and we'll see it soon in the Brisa, Tahar shenafla olav hazah imato. Do you hear this, my friends? The greatest agent, the most powerful catalyst to bring Tara is the mechatos. Says Rabbi Akiva, that if the mechatos was sprinkled on a tame, it does the job. If it was sprinkled on a tar, it does the opposite job. Instead of being mitayr him, he's already tar. Paradoxically, it's mitame him. I'm always reminded of Reb Chaim Brisker. They once asked Reb Chaim Brisker, why is it that in his yeshiva in Brisk they don't learn Mussar? The yeshivas during the 1800s, especially the end of the 19th century, there was a big Mussar movement that started with Rav Salanta. And Reb Chaim didn't let it in. So when they asked him why, he gave a mashal. He says there's something called castor oil. It's horrible, by the way. Anyway, if you're a chola, if you take castor oil, it can really, really help you. If you're a bari, you're healthy, it's going to get you sick. Baruch Hashem, he said, here in Brisk, we're all healthy. We don't need the castor oil of Mussar. In any event, says Rabbi Akiva, Mechatos is like castor oil in the mashal of Reb Chaim. If you give it to a tameh, it's mitarim. Give it to a tar, and it's mitamayim. Who could figure this out? Shlomo Amel couldn't figure this out. He called Amarti Echkema V'Rechoka Mimin. I'm such a wise person. I will study Paraduma, and I will become a brilliant interpreter of Paraduma, but Rechoka Mimeni, it's beyond my comprehension. It's therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, this whole enterprise of secluding the Kohen Gadol for a full week before Yom Kippur and doing Hazah every single day, when in fact the Kohen Gadol is tar, he's not tameh. Maybe he's tameh, but he's not tameh. Now he's tameh because you did the Hazah, says Rabbi Akiva, of mechatos on a tar, and mechatos on a tar makes him into tameh. There's no way, therefore, that you can reconcile Rabbi Akiva with that Mishnah, because the whole purpose of the 7 days is to prepare the Kohen Gadol for the Avodas HaKodesh. And instead, you're doing just the opposite. You are being metami the Kohen Gadol. This is really, really fascinating. So again, just to summarize, the Gemara tells us back on Daf Ches that according to Rabbi Meir, they did Hazah on the Kohen Gadol Kol Shivas Yom, every single day of the 7 days. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Chanina Skan Cohen disagree. They hold that the Hazah was only done on the 3rd and the 7th day. Fine. But either way, he was tar, and now according to Rabbi Akiva, he became tameh, which is antithetical to what this 7-day period of preparation is all about. Now, it is possible that the Tana of our Mishnah would also agree that there's no Hazah. After all, although Rabbi Meir holds, and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chanina, they all hold that there was Hazah during the 7-day period of preparation. But in our Mishnah here, it's not mentioned. So this Mishnah here could possibly reflect the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, that it's impossible to do Hazah on the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. And therefore, in theory, you could say that the Tana of our Mishnah would hold Ein Mazin Olav Klal B'Shivas Yomim. And there's a very, very interesting reason why the Gemara offers for this possibility. Again, according to Rabbi Akiva, we don't have to look for reasons, because Hazah during the 7 days would undermine the entire procedure. But there are other Tanoim that would agree with Rabbi Akiva for a totally different reason, that we don't do Hazah for 7 days. And that has to do with the sugi that you and I learned maybe 6 weeks ago, called Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. So that, what are you worried about? You want to do Hazah on the Kohen Gadol because maybe he's Tameh. Well, the Torah says that when it comes to Karbanos Tzibur, now mind you, every single Karban that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippurim as part of his special responsibilities, the Kohen Gadol is all a Karban Tzibur. And with regard to Korban Tzibur, there's one man the Omer holds Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. We don't have to go out of our way to be Matayr the Kohen Gadol. Let him be Tomei. What do I care? Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. And if you recall, Hutra means that we don't have to put in any effort to avoid and avert Tumah. It's Hutra B'Tzibur. So that when our Gemara says that the Loka Rabbi Akiva, what it means is not that there's a head-on collision between our Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva. In fact, the Mishnah might agree with one of the Tanoim that there was no Hazah during the 7 days because Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. But what the Gemara wants to point out is that even if you accept the authorship of our Mishnah to that Tana who doesn't require Hazah for 7 days, it still would not be Rabbi Akiva, because that Tana would say there's no need for Hazah. After all, Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. Rabbi Akiva says not only is there no need for Hazah, but Hazah undermines, and it's antithetical to exactly what we want to accomplish. Now, this 7-day period of seclusion, according to Rabbi Yochanan, back on Daf Dalet, is derived from the Shivas Yimei Miluim, if you recall. And that's a Doraisa halacha. Now, if that be the case, here's a kasha from one of the Achronim. Lefi Rabbi Yochanan, the Lamdus Hazah, Mimashenever B'Shivas Yimei Miluim, that Hazah, which was implemented during the 7 days of Miluim before the Kohanim started their avodah on the day that the Mishkan was established, that requirement of Hazah in Shivas Yimei Miluim is Doraisa. That's the Rabbi Akiva Shita, and that's the basis for the Shivas Yimei HaPrisha of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. If that be the case, given that analogy, according to Rabbi Yochanan, then the Kohen Gadol during the 7 days of Prisha would absolutely require Hazah on a Doraisa level. Now, what that would have to mean is that if the Torah is telling us that during the Shivas Yimei HaPrisha Kohen Gadol, like the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim when the Mishkan was erected, you require Hazah, then obviously he's not Tomei. So that according to Rabbi Yochanan, the mathematical conclusion that we have to derive is that the Torah is telling me to do the Hazah, and there is no Tumah, because the Torah is telling me to do the Hazah, culminating in the Avodas Yom Kippurim at the end of the week on the part of this Kohen Gadol. Very interesting. And based on this kasha, Siach Yitzchak, one of the famous, outstanding commentaries on the Masechet of ours, says that it must be that what we learn from the Torah in the equation between Shivas Yimei Miluim and Shivas Yimei Prisha Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, which is the basis for Rabbi Yochanan's conclusion that you need Hazah, that's all an asmachta. That's not a Doraisa halacha, it's just an asmachta. Where does Rabbi Akiva make this ruling that if you take the mei chatos and you sprinkle it on a tar, he becomes tummy? This Sanya we learned in the Brisa. The pasuk says in Parshas Chukas. I remember this pasuk because of my bar mitzvah. Anyway, it says v'hizah tahar al tameh b'yom hashlishi b'yom hashvi. Now wait a second. There are two words in this pasuk that are totally superfluous. It says v'hizah tar al hatameh. And the whole parsha is dealing with tameh. It starts and it continues and it ends with a person who contracted tumah. So why did the Torah have to say v'hizah al hatameh? Says Rabbi Akiva, let's darshan that when they sprinkle the mechatos al hatameh, he becomes tar. And the Torah wants to tell you that if you sprinkle the mechatos al tar, tameh. So when the Torah adds the two words al tameh, telling you that now he became tar, it's telling you by adding these superfluous redundant words that if he would have been tar, he becomes tameh. The Chachamim Omrim, they disagree. What do they do with the pasuk ala tameh? Ein hadvarim alolu amurim ela b'dvarim hamakablim tuma. It means that what the Torah wants to establish here by emphasizing ala tameh is that we're talking about something that could be makabel tumah. And the Torah is telling you that all the dinim that are mentioned in this parsha of Hazah only apply if the Hazah was sprinkled on something or someone that's makabel tumah. But if they were maz on someone or something that's not makabel tumah, that's not called Hazah. Now, you may recall that the Torah tells us in Parshas Chukas that we take something called an eitz azov, and this brush is used to dip into the mechatos and then sprinkle the hazah, the mechatos, on the tum. Now, what happens if that water of mechatos was used on something that's not makabel tum? We'll soon see the case of an animal. Now, there's still mechatos left in the azov, right? Because he dips it in, he sprinkles. The azov is still wet with residue mechatos. Now the question is, what's the status of that residue inside the eitz azov? And the Gemara explains right now what happens here. Maihi. What do the Chachamim mean when they say that a hazah on a davar she'eno makabel tumah is not called a hazah? What does that mean? I mean, if it's not makabel tumah, so it was just an exercise in futility. Kirisnan niskavi lahazos ala beime vizala adam if yesh be'ezov yishna. He had in mind to do a hazah on a behemoth, but at the end of the day, that's not what came to fruition. Instead, he did a hazah adam. Adam is a davar makabel tumah. Therefore, if there's still some mechatos left saturated in the azov, yishna. Now he can use whatever residue he has of mechatos and do a hazah in order to be mitarin. Now, why does he need a second hazah? The first hazah was without kavanah. And even though in general we paskin that mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavanah perhaps, but in the case of being mitayer, we need kavanah. And with the first hazah, there was no kavanah. However, it was a hazah on a davar makabel tumah, because at the end of the day, although he intended to be maz on an animal, he was maz on a human being. Hence, the residue mayim mechatos that's still saturated in the eitz azov is kosher, because there was no hazah on a davar she'eno makabel tumah. At the end of the day, he was maz on an adam, and adam is makabel tumah. So, although I grant you that we need a second hazah, but he can now, if we're lucky, implement the second hazah because there's still mechatos in the eitz azov. But in the opposite case, this kaven lahazos ala adam vehiz ala behema, which means that the person, the human being who is tameh, never received any mechatos on his body, he's for sure tameh. But moreover, the mechatos now becomes possible. If there's residue mechatos in the azov, he cannot use that mechatos to rectify his mistake and do a hazah on the other. And
Why
that's
is it possible?
Just 1 second, I'll be right with you. I just want to finish one sentence. This coming lahazos ala adam v'hiz al behema im yesh mechatos be'ezov. There's still residue lo yishna. He cannot use that mechatos. He's got to do what's called the new tevila to dunk the mechat, the azov, in mechatos that's in the utensil, because all the mechatos that was in the azov as a result of the first tefillah is all possible. And why is it possible? Because since that hazah, which landed on an animal, which is a davar she'eino makabel tumah, is not a hazah, then guess what? It becomes what's called a malach. Again, if I had a whiteboard, these are the two words that I would write on the whiteboard. There's hazah and there's malach. These are two antithetical concepts. If you used the mayim as a malacha instead of a hazah, then the mayim becomes possible. It disqualifies the mayim. Now, when do I determine that hazah was hazah? And when do I determine that hazah was a malacha and it wasn't a hazah? It's going to possibly disqualify the mayim. The answer is, was the hazah on a davar makabel tumah or on a davar she'eino makabel tumah? He had in mind to do hazah on an adam, but that never came to fruition. Instead, he did hazah on a behema. Behema is a davar she'eino makabel tumah, and that undermines the status of that hazah and classifies it instead as a malacha, because there are only two choices. It's either black or white. It's either hazah or it's a malacha. And malacha disqualifies mechatas. He's going to have to start again with a new tefillah to do, this is balayla zeh shtei pa'amim, two matbilim. He's got to do another matbilim. And he's got to take the eitz azov, dip it into the rest of the mechatas in the kli, and do a hazah on the tongue. Yeah. Sorry, Yisrael.
Well, that was my question. Why is it puzzled?
Oh, so that's halacha called malacha. Now, where is the source for mechatas nifsalim al yidei malacha? So this is a sugya in Masechet Para in the 4th perek. That's why I told you tonight we're learning Para Duma. Too bad we're not reading Parshas Chukas Nisha. Anyway, and in the Mishnah, in the 4th perek of Masechet Para, it says that malacha poseles mechatos. Now, we have to know the following. There is a seeming contradiction between the Mishnah in Para and our sugya. I'll tell you why. The Mishnah in Para qualifies this halacha of malacha poseles mechatos. What's the qualification? There's a two-stage process in preparing mechatos. First, we collect the mechatos into a kli, and then we add the efer hapara into that kli, and that concoction creates mechatos that can be mitay. So the Mishnah says that this psul of malacha applies only before the kiddush, which means before they added the efer hapara. We have now mayim, and if all things went well, the mayim have now been designated for mechatos. We took it kidasu kidin, we drew it from wherever we have to draw it from, and the spring water, blah, blah, blah. And now we're ready to put in the efer of the par. And that will be makadej, this concoction, as mechatos. Says the Mishnah, under what circumstances, in what scenario is there a psul of malacha? Only before the kiddush, before he added the efer hapara. If that be the case, then what's the Gemara hacking here in our sugya? It makes no sense. Our sugya is talking about the Kohen who's doing the hazah after he dips the eitz azov into the mechatos. The mechatos already had kiddush, and now you're telling me because he had a hazah on a behema, that hazah doesn't qualify, doesn't register on the Richter scale as hazah, therefore it becomes malach and it passes the mechatos. How is that possible? The Mishnah says that you can only pass the mechatos before the kiddush, which means that you disqualify the mayim. But once you added the efer hapara into the concoction and you were fully makadesh of this mixture called mechatos, At that point, it's totally impervious. It's like having a second inoculation. And it cannot be posel midin malacha. So the one who asks this kasha, and I've pointed out to you on a number of occasions that in addition to Tosfos on the page, we have on the right side, on the bottom, Tosfos Yishonim. And Tosfos Yishonim is very profound. He says that Hakavonakan lifsol malacha midirabana. On a doraisa level, there's no such thing as malacha poseles mechatas after the kiddush, once the Ephra Parah was mixed with the water. But the Rabbanon made a gzera, and they instituted a new category of a psul that's going to apply even after kiddush. So we have a full-fledged mixture of mayim together with Efer, and there was a sanctification. It's now on a doraisa level impervious to a psul malacha, and the Rabbanon said it's posel midrabbanan. An amazing, amazing chiddush of the Tosfos Yishonim puts this whole sugya into a different perspective. Okay. Now let me just quickly see if I missed anything here. Lo yeshane, eino rashoy loshu v'lahazbem el yitbol shuvas ha'izov b'mei chatzah v'kli shekain hamayim shahoyu b'ezov nifsalu kishehiza b'hem ala behema kevan she'eni makabelas tuma v'eina zo kazu nechshavas hazo el malacha u'mei chatas nifsalim kishenasis behem malacha. Right, we're going back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva learned from the extra words al hatame, that if they were maza on a tar, he became tame. The Chachamim don't accept that. They use al hatame to derive that if they were maza, the mechatas on a davar sheina makabel tuma, like a behema in our case, that is a malacha that undermines and disqualifies the mechatas. Gemara says, "My timer to Rabbi Akiva." We looked at the pasuk, and we don't see that it says in the pasuk anything so radical that if you're mazeh the mechatas on a tar, the tar becomes tameh. The Torah is saying something very innocuous, that if you take the mechatas and he's a tar ala tameh, then the tameh becomes tar. Says the Gemara, this was what bothered Rabbi Akiva. Nichtov Rachmana v'hiza hatar olav. It would have sufficed if the Torah told us that the maza, whose tar, was maza olav, and we know that the olav is on a tameh. My al hatame. Why does it have to say al hatame? Shmamino, it's coming to teach us that kshemazim al hatame nasatar. V'alatar, if he was maz on someone who was tar, nasaton. So the Gemara asks Rabbanon, why don't the Rabbanon darshan the pasuk exactly as Rabbi Akiva did and derive the same conclusion? Gemara says, "Hi lidvarim hamakablim tuma hudiyah." So we need the extra words alatame to teach me that's got to be a hazah on a davar hamakabel tuma. Otherwise, it's possibly din malach. Aval hacha. He says, if you want to derive Rabbi Akiva's derivation, that mechatas on a tar makes him into a tameh, it's kal v'chomer. You're contradicting the basic logic of a kal v'chomer, as we all felt intuitive. Im ala tameh tar, ala tar lo kolche. If this entity called mechatas is capable of taking a tameh and making him into a tar, then this entity could not do any harm and make somebody tameh if he's tar. If it's matayer a tameh, how much more so that it remains tar in the case of a tar. Rabbi Akiva, don't you know the basic logic of a kal v'chomer? So the Gemara answers, Hainu de ka'amar Shlomo. I'm not any worse than the smartest man that ever lived, who declared in Koheles Perek Zayin, Amarti ech kama v'hi rechoka mimeni. I could never figure out and unravel the mystery of paraduma. How could it be that you take an entity, a conduit for Tara, and instead it takes a Tara, making it into Tara? It just boggles the mind. It defies human comprehension. And as you know, the philosophers have a whole discussion here. Obviously, man was endowed with the power of intellect, but there's something that goes beyond human comprehension. Otherwise known, if you're familiar with the term, Zeras HaKos. It's a divine decree. And on a divine decree, we cannot ask questions. Here we have a division of opinions that goes through all the centuries of the giants of Torah. Some say, don't even touch it. Don't even make an attempt to understand it. It defies human comprehension. Suspend your rationality. And others say, we're going to try to derive some conclusion and make some sense. Now, keep in mind that whatever we say in order to interpret a halacha that's Xeris HaKosu, it's all speculation. We're not answering the question why. We'll have to wait till we get up to Shamayim and ask the man with the big G on the sweatshirt, can you give me some insight? But what we do is we try to derive some sort of a message, a spiritual or inspirational idea from the parasha, from the mitzvah. And in a sense, a classic example of that is going to be basa b'cholav, shatnez, any sort of combinations which the Torah prohibits. I mean, you could have a beggar that's made of tzemer, you could have a beggar made of linen, it's all mutter, but you combine them together, and once you weave them together, you're not allowed to wear it. It's a chiv malchus, and basa b'cholav, the basa is mutter, and you'll find, the one who is most outstanding in this area was Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine. He writes pages and pages trying to explain and rationalize the mitzvos that defy human comprehension. In the case of Paraduma, I have something to share with you, depending upon whether we have time, and if not tonight, maybe another occasion. For Rabbanon, so Rabbanon have to ask the question. Shlomo Melech admitted that the comprehension of Paraduma and its mechanics is beyond human understanding. Why is that so? The Rabbanon hold that if you take the Mechatos and you put it onto a tar, he remains tar. What Shlomo Melech had in mind was Lamazeh v'lamazim olav tahar. It means that if, let's say, I do the hazah and you receive the hazah, we're both tahar. But hanogea b'hem tameh. Anyone who touches the mechatos without a kli, meaning directly touches it, which you're not allowed to do, he becomes tameh. Just because he had a maga, he came in contact with the mechatos. Wait a second. If you touch a corpse, if you touch a sheretz, if you touch something that's tameh, I understand that you contract tumah. But if you're touching mechatos, which is the most powerful and primary vehicle of tara, why do you become tameh? That, says Shmuel, is beyond comprehension. The Gemara asks the following kasha. Umazeh tahar? If the Chachamim are looking in the parsha of Paradum and Chukas for something that defies human comprehension, it jumps right at you. The pasuk says, "Umazeh mei hanido yechabes b'gadav." Now, kibbutz b'gadim is always a phrase in the Bible for tvila b'mikvah, meaning for tara. And the Torah is saying that the mazeh The person who does the hazah, who's tar, he has to be tar. The pasuk says, "V'hizah tar al tameh." He now has to be mechabes b'gada, which means that because he did the hazah, he became tameh. My mazeh, what does the Torah mean when it says mazeh? Oh, this is Gemara's answer. So now let's appreciate the Gemara's kash. The greatest paradox that defies human comprehension in the Parsha Paraduma is right there explicit. And the Torah says that the mazeh himself becomes tam. But the Chachamim had said that no, the mazeh remains tar, but rather the nogea who touches the mechatos, he becomes tam. So the Gemara says, my mazeh, how did the Chachamim understand the word mazeh? Nogea. Whoa, that's really far from shot. Shuto shel mikra is that there's a mazeh and there's a nogea. But the Chachamim say that the mazeh is a reference to the nogea. The Gemara says that's impossible. Read the next part of the pasuk. It says, "Vanogea b'mechatos yitma ad ha'arhev." So this part of the pasuk that says "V'hiza hatar." I'm sorry. This part of the pasuk says "Umaze me hanida yechabes b'gadov," and then it says "Hanogea b'mechatos yitma al ha'arhev." So obviously there are two different persona here. There's one person who's maze, and there's another person who's nogea, because the pasuk spells out both of them. It says maze me nido yechabes b'gadov, and then it says hanogea b'me nido yitma al ha'arhev. The ode, and furthermore, maze boy kibus begadim, nogea lo boy kibus begadim. In other words, with regard to a person who comes in contact with the mechatos, the Torah doesn't mention kibus begadim. The Torah says yitma ad ha'aret, which obviously means that there's a difference between a nogea and a maze. In the case of a maze, the Torah says yechabes begadim. In the case of an ogea, the Torah says v'tamei ad ha'aret. So Mitzvah Shem, we don't have time to go into it tonight, but we will next week. We're going to talk about the difference between the kibes gadov and v'tamei ad ha'aret. But I just wanted to finish up this sugya, and then we'll expand a little bit next week in Mitzvah Hashem. Elamai mazeh. Our answer is, what does the word mazeh mean? No say. That if a person actually carries the mechatos, even though he's not in direct contact with the mechatos, the chatos is now in a kli, but he's carrying the kli, he's called a mazeh. And in the case of a mazeh, the Torah is telling, in the case of a mazeh who is a no-say, the Torah is saying v'chibes gadol. In the case of an ogea, he's not carrying the mechatos, but he's touching the mechatos. The Torah says v'tamei ad ha'aret. In any event, Rabotzai, just to summarize what we have here, fascinating machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Rabbi Akiva came to the conclusion that if you do a hazah on a tahar, he becomes tameh. Hence, it's impossible that during the 7 days of Prisha, when the Kohen Gadol is preparing for the great culmination, the day of Avodas Yom Kippur, that we're going to do hazah, because then he's going to become tameh and he's possibly avoid. The Chachamim, on the other hand, hold that if you take mechatos and you sprinkle on a tameh, it's mitar him. How much more so if you sprinkle it on a tahor? And Rabbi Akiva says, look, Shlomo Melech concedes that amarti echkama v'rechoka mimeni. I can't understand the whole parsha of Paradum, and that's a reference to this halacha that if you are mazeh mechatos on a tar, he becomes tam. Chacham deny it. Chacham say what boggled the mind of Shlomo Melech is the fact that in the case of an ogea, who came in contact with the Mechatos, he contracts Tumah, even though the Mechatos itself is the greatest conduit of Tara. And alternatively, the Gemara says, again against the Chachamim, that it could be that when the Torah says Umazi Yechabes Badav, it's referring to the person who did the Hazan, he implemented the Hazan paradoxically, or to defy human understanding, he becomes Torah. This is where we're going to conclude for tonight. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. And we're here on Daf Yudalid, towards the bottom of the Amud, and we're up to Ella Mai.
Tov.
I appreciate that you turned on your camera. I wish everyone would do like you did it, even just for a second, so I could see your pretty face, to turn on your camera.
Lala Tov. Shkayach. How was the chisun? Your chisun went okay?
So far, so good. I mean, I could show you my piece of cotton, the cotton ball, and I feel just as good as after the first chisun. So let's hope it. And by the way, this time it was very organized, and not like the first time. It was a kind of a balagan. I waited for 40 minutes. That's why I thought I would be late tonight, and it turns out that Baruch Hashem I wasn't late. Okay then.
Shabbat shalom.
Great week. Thank you so much. All the best.